The morning they told me Lorraine Pike had left me $8.7 million. I was still thinking about my husband's face when I pulled into a parking garage in West Loop and an SUV came hard around the corner without slowing. The hit threw my car sideways into concrete. And after that, there was nothing except a clean black silence that lasted 4 days. Long enough for the world outside my body to rearrange itself without asking me. I woke in a hospital bed with my arm locked in place, pain living in my ribs, a cracked phone in a plastic bag, and the ugly, stupid hope that Grant would be the first thing waiting. He wasn't there, and the nurse's careful expression told me that before my phone did, but I still reached for it with my good hand and scrolled through missed calls. Then I saw his post, a long, polished paragraph under a photo from our 5th anniversary, and right there above hundreds of condolences were the words, "My beloved wife passed suddenly, and I'm asking for privacy while I grieve." I read it twice because the first time felt like concussion haze. The second time felt worse. And by the third, I understood my husband had not mistaken me for dead. He had started living as if I were. By the time I reached his voicemail again, he had already emptied our joint account, told our landlord I was gone, and moved into a new apartment with a woman named Tessa Morrow. I had not spent $1 in the inheritance, had not signed a single document, had not even made it home. And still Grant was already building his next life on top of mine. Lying there with my heart monitor climbing beside me, I understood something cold and exact. My husband had not been waiting to see whether I survived, only whether anyone else would notice. Before the accident, my life was small in the ordinary Chicago way, built from school bells, grocery receipts, and checking whether the gas tank could wait until Friday again. I worked attendance at a public high school on the north side, drove an aging sedan, and kept dinner simple because simple was still what we could afford. Grant handled estimates for a renovation company, wore fatigue like a badge, and treated every quiet room in our apartment like proof that I had failed him somehow. He was never loud enough to leave a mark, which made it easier to quietly rename the damage as stress, disappointment, or a man feeling overlooked at work. After another stalled promotion, he stopped asking real questions, spoke through clipped notes on the refrigerator, and once glanced at my Sunday plans and asked, "That woman still alive?" I should have heard contempt in that sentence, but I heard exhaustion. The version I kept choosing because it was easier than admitting my marriage was dying in sections. I never told Grant much about Lorraine Pike, partly because he dismissed anything that did not turn into money, and partly because I wanted one part completely untouched there. Still, over the past few months, he had started paying attention in a way that felt wrong much later, asking what neighborhood she lived in and whether she had family. Looking back from that hospital bed, with his fake grief glowing on my screen, I could see how long he had already been circling something I thought belonged to me. I called Grant 4 times before he picked up, and when his voice finally came through, it carried the flat patience people use with strangers, not wives in trauma. I told him I was awake and still in the hospital, and he gave me, there were things to handle, like my body had somehow become paperwork. When I pushed harder, asking what kind of husband heard his wife had survived that crash and still stayed gone anyway, the line went dead before he lied better. Melanie came the next morning with her coat half-buttoned, coffee I could not drink, and the face of someone who had already learned far too much. She opened my banking app, turned the screen toward me, and there it was, the joint account stripped, almost completely clean, in less than 48 hours. Then came the rest, each piece colder than the last, the message to our landlord, the signed move-out notice, and a new lease tied to River North. Melanie kept scrolling and told me Grant was not alone in that apartment for months, and suddenly a woman named Tessa Morrow was standing in my ruined life. She worked at a print and shipping center near downtown, had been seen with him before, and looked exactly like someone who knew how professional forms worked. I had not touched the inheritance, had not signed anything, had not even left the hospital, And still, my husband had already started completely deleting me from the financial record. Owen Baxter came to the hospital the following afternoon with a leather briefcase, a tablet tucked under one arm, and the restrained expression of a man bringing bad news. He set the tablet across my tray table, opened security footage from his office lobby, and let me watch Grant stride in like someone already entitled to everything. Before I had signed a single probate document, before I had even heard the number aloud, my husband was on camera asking about the $7 million estate itself. Owen told me inherited assets did not become marital property just because a husband wanted them badly enough. And that sentence changed the temperature of the room for me. Grant had arrived carrying documents meant to suggest I was either dead or temporarily incapable. But the paperwork looked polished in all the wrong ways to Owen at first. A death notice formatted like theater, an authorization too eager to transfer control, and language no legitimate estate office would ever mistake for normal paperwork to anyone there at all. Then Owen gave me the part that burned cleanest. Grant had used the exact figure in his first call, which meant he already knew it before I ever did. He believed he could get ahead of probate if he controlled my status first. And hearing that was worse than waking up alone in that bed, still breathing there. I stared at Grant on the screen, one hand on a reception desk, and understood my marriage had not collapsed under strain, only under calculation at all that day. Melanie kept building the timeline from her phone, and with every swipe, Tessa Morrow looked less like an affair and more like part of the machinery itself. The River North lease had been signed months earlier, and attached to it were service confirmations from the print and shipping center where Tessa worked downtown there. There were scan receipts, forwarding records, and document pickups clustered around the same weeks Grant started watching my Sunday visits with that sharpened, newly curious attention again. Then Melanie showed me 2 photos taken before my crash. Grant beside Tessa outside her storefront at dusk, both of them carrying flat document envelopes there. I had been willing to believe in one selfish man, but those photos made room for something colder. A woman who understood exactly what mattered most. Melanie tapped the screen and gave me, "She wasn't just sleeping with him." And in that moment, Tessa stopped looking secret and started looking useful too. Tessa handled forms, scans, overnight packets, all the ordinary paperwork most people never notice, which meant she knew exactly how bad documents got made to feel routine. By then, I understood the worst part was not that Grant had replaced me, but that the woman beside him had already helped so completely erase me. What chilled me was knowing they had likely sat together somewhere ordinary, under fluorescent lights, quietly deciding how a wife could be removed without leaving anything behind. Owen and Melanie kept pulling at Grant's paperwork until one unfamiliar name surfaced again and again across call logs, visitor notes, and attachment headers in his file. Caleb Rowan. At first I assumed he was another witness Grant planned to use. Some man willing to sign where directed and help make fraud look procedural for whatever he needed. Then Owen found a reunion registry reference linked to Caleb's file, plus a DNA match notation tied to Chicago that same week. And the room changed shape around me entirely. I had seen that kind of silence before, years earlier in my mother's closet, when I found a small box she took from my hands too quickly without explanation. Inside had been a newborn hospital bracelet and nothing else I was allowed to ask about when I was 7, which meant Caleb's name landed on an old bruise. My mother had been dead 5 years, but suddenly Grant's scheme was no longer only about money, because another life I should have known was standing inside it already. Melanie read Caleb's background aloud from her screen. Steent. Louis. Distribution Center, Supervisor. Years of registry submissions. And one unresolved search for immediate family members. Grant had somehow found him before I did. And once truth settled in, I understood he had been hunting inheritance and blood for months long before I opened my eyes. He had reached into my family before I even knew there was a door. And that was the first moment I felt true fear in my life again. I had spent hours staring at Caleb Rowan's name on Owen's tablet to understand one thing. Truth was not going to save me unless I helped it. So I asked Melanie to text from a number Grant would not recognize, short enough to feel urgent and true enough to get read. It said the person he came to Chicago for was awake in my hospital room and ready to talk before anything got signed. Owen handled the legal edges, the nurse handled the timing, and Melanie angled my phone so every useful word would land on tape. Grant already believed I was weak, grateful, and still catching up, which made arrogance the easiest trap to leave open for him. For the first time since I woke up, I stopped thinking like a wife abandoned in public and started thinking like evidence with a pulse. I did not need Grant to confess everything, because men like him rarely call themselves thieves when they still feel entitled. I only needed him to walk into my room carrying papers, explain control as care, and speak long enough to bury himself alive. By the time Grant reached for his briefcase, the plan was simple, quiet, and finally mine, which mattered more than the money. Once Grant realized the papers would not save him, the rest collapsed fast, because polished lies stop looking polished the second someone matches them against records. Owen handed everything over. The forged documents, the transfer history, the false statements about my condition, and every clean little step Grant had counted on staying separate. By the end of that week, the legal language around him had changed from husband, tenant, an authorized contact to fraud, attempted theft, and filing false documents. The crash itself never became the charge I wanted most, because suspicion is not proof, and the city never gives you justice in the exact shape you ask. But once investigators opened his finances, they found enough. And Grant took a plea because public trial would have pulled every private calculation fully into daylight. He stopped looking like a wronged husband almost immediately. And without that performance, he was only a man who tried to convert my body into access. Tessa did not get to disappear behind romance either, because the scans, service logs, and routed packets tied her too closely to the paperwork she helped move. She lost the job that had made her useful, gave statements to protect what little remained of her own future, and learned that competence turns expensive when attached to fraud. Nobody walked away untouched, and for the first time since waking up, I felt the world correcting itself. After Grant was gone, Caleb stayed, and the silence between us felt nothing like the silence Grant had built, because this one held shock, caution, and room. He showed me an old photograph he had carried for years, our mother younger than I had ever known her, turned half away, wearing the same small locket. I told him I still had it in my apartment, and something shifted across his face. Not relief exactly, but the look of hope landing carefully. We did not become family in one graceful moment, because real things almost never arrive that cleanly after being mishandled by someone else for gain. We only sat there with the evidence between us. His photograph, my memory, our mother's silence, and understood that Grant had reached into something real. The cruelest part of his plan had accidentally returned a brother to me, and the first good thing I felt after surviving was that truth. Months later, I used part of Lorraine Pike's estate to fund reading programs and reunion support, because surviving Grant meant nothing if I built better. I went back to the school where attendance still mattered, where kids still forgot pencils and deadlines, and where my life belonged to me again. Caleb moved slowly into that future, not as a miracle dropped from nowhere, but as family returned late and treated with the care truth deserves. The money never saved me, though it gave me reach, and when people asked what changed, the only answer was, I stayed, and meant it. Thank you for staying with me through this story and carrying it all the way to the end. If one moment stayed with you, leave it in the comments so I can read it. Stay close for the next story, because some truths arrive quietly and still change everything.